Thank you so much for coming to this ATS webinar titled Being, Becoming, Belonging, Defining and Understanding Professional Identity Formation. This webinar, we hope if it goes well, will be one of many that are hosted by the section on medical education's PIF pod. I'm Timothy Dyster, one of the members of the PIF pod, and I'm joined today by 4 of the 5 founding members, and then by an expert discussant, Dr. Justin Bullock. I thought we could open by having my fellow members of the pod who were part of idea aiding and creating this session introduce themselves. And then later on in the session, I'll introduce Dr. Bullock to recognize that he's joining us as an expert, and we appreciate him making some time. So I'll start off by handing off to Dr. John.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mira John. I am faculty at UCSD, the Pulmonary Critical Care Division, and my scholarly interests include professional identity formation within fellowship recruitment and job hunting spaces.
And then
Hi,
next,
everyone. Yep. Excuse me, I'm Emily Olson. I am currently a third-year pulmonary and critical care fellow at Northwestern University in Chicago, and will be joining faculty in the pulmonary critical care division at Mayo Clinic Rochester this fall. My particular interests related to professional identity formation include related to gender identity in particular, and how that impacts career development and where decisions go. I'd like to introduce Dr. Stiller next.
Hi, my name is Robin Stiller. I'm on faculty at Oregon Health and Science University, and my interests lie in the competing tensions between how your personal identity evolves in the face of rigorous clinical training and aggressive professional identity formation.
And then once again, I'm Dr. Timothy Dyster, and my thesis work was in self-disclosure and how medical students learn to talk about their personal selves at work, which relates to how they might manage and develop their professional identity. So today what we're hoping to do is to go through a few slides and then have an active discussion with our expert discussant. And by the end of the session, our hope is that we'll have accomplished the following. That you'll be able to describe professional identity formation within a community of practice, that you're able to define the modes of belonging, and that you're able to describe some medical education research with implications for fostering inclusive environments. So how are we going to accomplish those goals? Well, first of all, we're going to answer the question, what is professional identity formation? And then we'll answer how does support, within a learning environment relate to professional identity formation? And then we'll close by answering the question, how can I use existing research to guide my educational approaches? And so to start off, I thought it would be helpful to ask a big question that I hope you'll sit with on your own for a moment, which is, what is the purpose of medical school and medical training? And I think historically, we might come up with answers like learning the skills of a doctor, or developing the attitudes that physicians are supposed to have. But if we actually step back from this and think about medical school and training as a process of socialization, we might give different answers. And those answers are the description of professional identity formation as a construct. So let's answer this first question, what is professional identity formation? And we'll start off with some history and definition. We'll define a framework called communities of practice. We will list out the modes of belonging, and then we'll make a connection to support in the environment. So when we think about where professional identity formation came from, it can be helpful to situate ourselves within a broader, longstanding discourse about what professionalism is. And in order to do that, we have to recognize sort of 3 large movements within professionalism as a construct over the history of medicine. The first is virtue-based professionalism, which actually dates back to Hippocrates. The second is behavior-based professionalism, which is a more modern idea. And then the third is professional identity formation, which would be this most recent iteration on this idea. Virtue-based professionalism, the oldest of these schools, really focused on moral character, moral reasoning, and humanism as aspects of what it meant to be a physician. And those are still things that carry forward today, and there are good things from each of these movements, including the virtue-based one. The difficulty with this first movement was it was hard to measure, and so when measurement became really important in education, we moved to behavior-based professionalism, which focused on observed behaviors, hitting certain milestones, and developing certain levels of competency. And what these all share in common is that they were more overtly measurable than, say, someone's ability to do moral reasoning. And this final movement, which is more recent over the last decade, professional identity formation, instead focuses on who we are and who we are becoming. So it thinks a lot about how our identities change over the course of training, and the social forces that might shape that process. And so to give this an actual definition, we can say that professional identity formation refers to the process by which a layperson becomes socialized into the community of medicine, and through this process constructs their identity as a physician. And this idea was made popular by the Cruises, whose paper was linked to in the materials for this ATS webinar. And when I explain this idea, I like to think of it in sort of a simple schematic. There's really beautiful and complicated ones from the citation at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, but I think this simplified version can be helpful. So when you arrive to a program or to a school, you bring who you were as a person and who you were as a professional when you got there. We could think of that as who you are at entry into a program. And then through entering the community of that program, you go through a socialization process. During this, you get exposed to, engage with, and hopefully critically examine the current professional norms and values. And as an aspect of that, assess how aligned you are yourself with those current professional norms and values. And this can result in an assessment of being fully aligned or being not at all aligned and everything in between. And like any other change in identity, this process produces emotional responses, tensions, and reactions. Over time, this changes how we think of ourselves and how we feel about ourselves, and we develop evolving personal and professional identities that dynamically have to be both fostered and maintained. And we can think of that as who you are becoming, and that who that you're becoming continues in that socialization process throughout the time that you're in a given community. And this particular view of how identities forms comes from an educational theory or framework called communities of practice. A community of practice, or community of practice as a theory, highlights that learning occurs through social fabrics. And it describes, unsurprisingly, groups of people, but they have some key characteristics. First, they share a passion or interest. Second, they learn via interactions that are centered around that interest. Third, through those interactions, they organically define and then iteratively redefine what it means to be competent. And that involves an ongoing negotiation between old timers in the community and newcomers who might have their own important ideas from the outside world about what it means to be a certain kind of professional. And iteratively, through that process of bringing newcomers in, renegotiating what it means to be competent, these communities sustain and reiterate themselves over the course of time. When this theory gets used in med ed, and it has become pretty popular over the last decade, there's a couple things that sometimes happen that are misuses of the original theory. So one is that communities of practice are inherently local. When we think about the whole landscape of practice, we can identify lots of communities that we're a part of, ranging from very, very small teams that you might be on to perhaps a division or a department. The second is that you cannot technically found a community of practice. There was a period in the development of the framework where this idea got introduced, but it eventually kind of got removed by the original author of this idea. And the concept here is that you can foster community by setting up certain conditions, but saying that you're founding a community of practice sort of betrays some misunderstanding about some core tenets of the theory. So if you're going to use this in your own scholarly work, I'd encourage you to avoid that kind of verbiage. Within communities of practice, we can then ask, well, what's the mechanism of this process of forming an identity? And this piece of communities of practice actually wasn't translated very much into the medical education literature when the theory was first described there. And the three modes are engagement, imagination, and alignment. So engagement refers to participating in the practice of a community, which includes defining the shared undertaking and the meaning of pursuing that undertaking. So we could, for example, imagine for someone who lays bricks that the actual activity, the engagement, would be participating in bricklaying. Imagination involves expanding ourselves and envisioning across time and space the different connections to both past and future selves, or to a larger or shared endeavor. So, for someone who lays bricks, and this was an example in the original description of the theory, you can imagine if someone came by and asked, "Well, what are you doing?" And one person said, "Well, I'm laying bricks," and the other said, "I'm building a cathedral." Those two people, through the same engagement, may ultimately come to identify very differently. There's an aspect of seeing their engagement as evidence of a specific future self that causes identities to form the way that they do. And then the final mode is alignment. And this is contributing to a broader undertaking, and that can be coordinating your own energy, actions, and activities, or inspiring other people to contribute. And when these three things are present in this model, a new identity will begin to form. So what's the connection to support? Um, so there's a lot of great literature on learning environments, and the paper in this bottom right-hand corner does a really good job of describing how learners are sometimes treated poorly or mistreated, and how to distinguish that from some suboptimal learning environments, but that they're related. And so in a model like this one, we can see any environment as on a spectrum between unsupportive and supportive. And that can involve things that are explicitly or implicitly marginalizing, that are punitive, threaten to punish, that penalize uncertainty, that treat learners as interchangeable and not having their own features as humans and people. All the way from that level of lack of support to very supportive, where there's explicit or implicit centralization, where people are encouraged, pedagogical explanations are offered, uncertainty is regarded as natural and safe, and where learners are recognized as individuals. And we know from this paper that looked specifically at educator identity formation that whether we're in a space or a context with support really affects what happens to identities that we do have. On the left side of this graph, we can see in the context with low support, particularly if we ourselves don't feel very much agency in continuing to do a certain kind of work like education, we will see identities that previously formed erode over time. And depending on the specific blend of context, support, and agency of an individual, other things can happen, with the best case being a supportive environment where someone feels like an agent in doing the work they want to do, where identities will continue to feel salient and maintain. So that's your little primer on some of these big ideas that I hope set us up to have a really awesome discussion with our expert discussant. And the way that we're choosing to approach today is something that the PIF pod is calling Educator's Report. Many of you are probably familiar with case settings or case conferences where an expert will be presented a case without information or too much information ahead of time, and they'll think through it organically. And so we're going to try something, and it's an experiment, so we're interested to see how it goes and to get feedback. But we're kind of creating that setting here. Our expert has been told in broad strokes a little bit about what's going to happen in this educational case. He knows that it's related to research and scholarship that he has done, but doesn't have exact specifics of what's going to be presented. So he'll be thinking about the case we present in front of you in real time, giving us all a chance to see how he draws on the literature in making educational choices. As a way to support that, beforehand, we asked Dr. Bullock if he'd like to submit a few images that could be used supplementally from some of his own papers and work. And we have those on hand in case any of them feel relevant. But what you're about to experience is an unrehearsed discussion, and we hope that makes it engaging and fun. And so I would be remiss not to begin by introducing our fantastic expert, Dr. Justin Bullock, and I hope it's okay I picked this photo. It was a very popular result on the Google image search I did. So Dr. Bullock is a faculty member at the University of Washington, where he practices nephrology at Harborview Medical Center. He holds multiple degrees in addition to his medical doctorate, and in addition to UW, University of Washington, his educational pedigree spans MIT, UC Berkeley, and UCSF. Dr. Bullock is also the co-director of the Docs for Disabilities Initiative, or with Disabilities Initiative, I apologize, and he serves on the editorial board for Teaching and Learning in Medicine. He's the recipient of multiple awards, so many, in fact, that at UCSF he was recognized with a Lifetime Achievement Award before even being a faculty member. And these awards recognize him in many different domains for his outstanding character, his phenomenal teaching, and his high impact scholarship. Dr. Bullock's primary research focuses on how educators can foster safety in the clinical environment and in other learning environments, and that made him uniquely qualified as a discussant for today's educational case. So thank you again, Dr. Bullock, for both holding for this intro to come late in this presentation and for being here today with us. We're very lucky to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. Please call me Justin. And that was very kind, Tim. Thanks.
Of course. All right, so let's, without further ado, move to our case. So you were rounding in the intensive care unit in July, accompanied by a diverse team of learners, including a pulmonary and critical care fellow, an internal medicine senior resident, 2 interns, and a 4th-year medical student on her acting internship in critical care medicine, something that on the East Coast might have been called a sub-internship. 15 minutes after rounds have begun, the 4th-year medical student arrives, visibly frazzled and rushed. Noticing the late arrival, the fellow says, "Operating on your own time zone today?" in a slightly sarcastic tone. The student, clearly flustered, freezes momentarily with widened eyes, but remains silent. Observing the lack of response, the fellow awkwardly moves forward with rounds without further addressing the lateness. The student wears a sticker on her badge with she/her pronouns, and her skin tone is dark. She makes less eye contact than usual during her subsequent presentations and seems distracted. So Dr. Bullock, we wanted to bring this moment to you, again, kind of in the shadow, a positive shadow of your scholarship, and ask you what some of your first impressions might be given the studies and work that you've done when you read a vignette or hear a vignette like this one.
Yeah. So the first thing that I'll say is, as you were reading, I actually felt my heart rate like start to speed up a little bit. I think so there's a few things that are sort of flying through my head immediately. The first thing is, there's a lot of sort of complex power dynamics that are happening. Like, so I'm so assuming that I'm gonna, if I were the attending on this team, that there's a little bit of, we could, it's unclear the intention of what the fellow was saying, but it's clear from this sort of description that this comment sort of threw the student off a bit. And one of the things that this sort of whole vignette really makes me think is it really makes me want to push to get to the pre-brief, something that I call pre-brief, quite quickly. And I think once I explain the pre-brief, then I'll explain how I think it would be helpful in this situation. So the pre-brief is something that arose from a study with medical learners, with medical students who are clinical medical students, where we basically were asking students how they would feel most supported if they were to experience a microaggression and someone on the team were to see them, like how they want to be supported by other members of the team. And from this, there are a few things that came out, and we sort of broke our framework into a before, during, and after. The pre-brief is, to me, powerful in this scenario, even though I'm not exactly sure whether or not I would call this a microaggression. Like maybe I would slightly relate it to like training level, but yeah, it's a little bit hard for me to categorize it. But essentially, what the pre-brief is it's an anticipatory conversation that you have with a team collectively, ideally before something bad happens, that basically empowers the individual and the team to be supported in the way that's most helpful for them. And so for me, how that looks is typically, we come together as a team and, ideally on the first day, as soon as we're together, it's like, I'm such and such, we talk about our roles on the team. Ideally, we do introductions. We try to avoid sort of the, introductions that just list your academic pedigree, and, you talk about sort of how people will be assessed, giving feedback, the bathrooms are over here, et cetera. And then for me, the thing that I always close my introduction with is by saying, we all hold many different identities, and sometimes our identities come up in different ways as we're, working and learning, and sometimes in ways that are very uncomfortable. And basically, I want to talk about how we can sort of best protect each other in the event of one of those uncomfortable moments. Apologies, I'm not sure if y'all can hear the sound above me. Okay. Um, and for me, and I will often say, I'm going to share my identities because I like to share my identities, but you absolutely don't have to. I identify as a man who's gay, Black, and bipolar, and all of those identities sort of come up in different times, in different ways. As we're in the hospital, and in the event that something sort of one of my ideas were to come up in an uncomfortable way, I usually feel comfortable bringing it up myself. But there have been a few moments where I've frozen, and in that case, I would appreciate if someone on the team spoke up. Um, and usually, as I do the pre-brief, will start with myself, and then I will go to the hierarchically the next sort of person on the medical hierarchy. So when I was a resident or fellow, that meant I would ask my attending first. When it was just me, or if I was attending, then I would sort of talk with the senior fellows or senior residents, et cetera. And the reason why and part of the conversation for me is, I like to also say, I might be someone who commits a microaggression or makes someone feel uncomfortable in some way. And if that happens, I hope you'll either feel comfortable telling me or you'll tell one of the senior residents or senior fellows. And basically, what I found this conversation to do is it completely shifts the dynamics around sort of interpersonal interactions on the team. It sort of brings them sort of to the forefront. So for me, when I read this interaction, the reason why my heart would be racing is because I would be frustrated myself because I haven't pre-briefed yet. Which at least in this case, I haven't. And so I would usually use this as a moment to say, oh, I think we should pause. There's something I'd like to do, and I would sort of, and I think one of the other sort of dynamics that I would certainly be trying to navigate is, I don't want to, the question is always, who do I owe protection first? And what I would say is, I have a personal belief that, we as educators or we as people who have privilege have a duty to the most marginalized or most vulnerable first. And so there's a risk of me saying something that I might undermine my fellow. But for me, my duty is to my medical student first. And similarly, there's sometimes where this judgment can be very subjective. So if there's like, for instance, like a resident and a patient, there's some sort of complex interactions where you have to judge which person you believe. And for me, that is a lot based on how I'm sort of experiencing the identity dynamics in the learning environment. So I think so I would say at this point, what I would do is I would try to sort of call a timeout in some way, and sort of give this opportunity to do a pre-brief. And my hope would be through pre-briefing, the fellow would take an opportunity to apologize or to recognize that they'd said something that might have thrown off the medical student. And if not, then I would sort of think through how to bring it up, or talk, separately or together. Depending on how everyone was reacting and interacting with each other.
That's super interesting, Justin, and I think a really helpful pearl about this concept of pre-briefing. I'm wondering if the vignette had a small riff in it where what the fellow said was more clearly a microaggression. How would you make sense of the students' like subsequent seeming dazed or distracted on rounds?
Yeah. What I would do is I would try to take it off of the student, and I would say, oh, I'm feeling a little bit uncomfortable. This, like, that statement made me a little bit uncomfortable. And for me, the lucky thing is I always will just go into I kind of say like, I think a lot, I study a lot about identity dynamics and learning environment, and I feel like there's an identity dynamic that's important that's happening right now. I would try really hard not to force the learner to like disclose that they felt uncomfortable or they felt microaggressed. I would try to make sort of an opportunity that if they felt that way, that they could bring it up but we've had some learners say to us in studies, and actually in that this paper that I mentioned, the study actually came from the fact that there was a learner who had a very sort of visibly minoritized identity, and they were often microaggressed by patients. And our team would like stop and debrief after every time that one of these happened. And what the learner said was like, for them, the repeated debriefing was actually not helpful, that they wanted to just learn and stop sort of centering their identity. And so people have this is again why like the pre-brief is just so powerful, because it really just like helps you do what people say they want. And then you also allow opportunities for people to sort of revise. But yeah, but if there was a more visible, yeah, I would try to make some, one of the big fears I think that people have a lot around responding to microaggressions is because they can often feel like you have to have this big like antagonistic crash. And my goal is often to like, how do I find a way to like, because no one can invalidate my feeling uncomfortable. If I say, oh, there's something that happened that made me feel a little uncomfortable, it's a very owning it for myself statement. Um, yeah, so I think that would be my first sort of like response, tend response.
And then I know some of your work has looked at how this all intersects with cognitive load as well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
mm,
Okay, please, please.
and I was wondering if the subsequent kind of behavior from the student for you is what cognitive overload does look like,
Yeah.
and how that might connect to your work too.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to give a personal story and then I'll give my research,
Okay.
what our participants have said. So this is kind of similar, but like, yeah, it was my personal extreme example of, usually I respond, but there's been a few times where I've frozen. I once was a senior resident in the ICU, in a place where I felt at this point I felt like quite clinically like comfortable. It's kind of towards the end of residency. It had been overnight, and basically there was a patient who saw me who was not my patient, who then began to repeatedly yell the N word over and over. And it happened. We were in the ICU. Where like I was clearly the only black person, so like I don't either. They were like seeing like black people who weren't there, or they were referring to me. And as I was presenting, I attempted to keep presenting, and I started kind of like stumbling. And I'm someone who I get very conscious of my like speaking, especially when I'm trying to like intellectualize and like just begin to fumble like more and more and more. And it was towards the end of my presentation where one of my co-residents said, "Hey, Justin, do you want to go over like one unit over to the next ICU and stop sitting here?" And I think like intuitively we could all think about why that might be sort of challenging to present with, but basically what's happening with identity threats, and for me, identity threat I use to mean any intrapersonal, interpersonal, or structural sort of interaction that can sort of that is hostile to one's identity in some way. And one of the things that happens is when someone is made sort of conscious or aware of their identity, they can often experience something called stereotype threat. And stereotype threat is a psychological phenomenon in which members of negatively stereotyped groups fear fulfilling those negative stereotypes. And that fear impairs performance. And stereotype threat is just one example of an identity threat. There are many different examples of identity threats, microaggression, racism, xenophobia, sexism, sexual harassment, etc. And what all of these do is they basically increase an individual's cognitive load. So cognitive load theory is a theory that's often used in education, which basically says we all have working memory and we use our working memory to accomplish the tasks in front of us. And usually we say that memory can hold 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. And that's why everyone says phone numbers are 7 digits long, et cetera, et cetera. And in our working memory, the working memory must accommodate the intrinsic difficulty of a task. So the first time that you're placing a central line, you have a much higher intrinsic load than the 100th time that you're placing a central line. And this is why identity threats are particularly harmful for people who are learning, because the folks who are more advanced, they may not experience it in the same way because they don't have the same intrinsic load as others. There's the extraneous load, which is the distractor information that consumes your working memory, but doesn't help you accomplish the task. And the germane load, which is like the part of your brain space that you use to build illness scripts and chunk information and all these things. And what happens when people experience identity threats is that their extraneous load is significantly increased, the distractor load. So it's something that distracts someone, but doesn't help them accomplish the task. and therefore it sort of overwhelms their cognitive load and impairs their ability to learn and demonstrate learning. And what I often say is, you can imagine how over a lifetime of being minoritized in medicine, you can experience a number of sort of these hits that basically impair your learning and your ability to demonstrate your learning and your performance. So that's one reason why I think identity threats are incredibly important to attend to, because basically the goal of responding early is you're short-circuiting this extraneous load. Oftentimes people spend a lot of time sort of spinning like, was that actually microaggression? Am I being too sensitive? All these things. And by just naming an uncomfortable interaction and sort of giving the response that a learner wants, you ideally are reducing that extraneous load and therefore sort of protecting their cognitive load.
That's super interesting and such a cool link between this like social and cognitive elements of what we do in learning environments. I'm wondering if you feel ready for aliquot 2.
Sure, I'm curious if anyone has any other thoughts or they want to share.
All right. I think we're going to have Dr. John read this aliquot. So, Dr. John, take us away.
Sure. Okay. After rounds, you notice that the student is lingering near the workroom and seems upset. You are not sure exactly what to do or what the student might need in this moment. Following your best instincts, you approach her gently and you ask if she'd like to talk. Initially hesitant, she quietly explains that she was delayed due to an unexpectedly prolonged interaction with the patient, trying to provide comfort and reassurance during a difficult conversation. She then shares, with visible discomfort, a question about whether her lateness might have been more readily overlooked had she been a lighter-skinned student. You listen attentively and try to be supportive, but feel torn. You really like your current fellow, and wonder whether they, quote, meant it that way. You wonder if others struggle with these conversations, and you seek out the opinion of a trusted colleague.
So, Dr. Bullock, I think in this case, if you want to take on the role of the trusted colleague, as someone who I think many of us, or at least I have turned to in moments like this one, I was curious how you might guide someone who comes for this sort of advice.
Yeah, I love this aliquot because I already stepped into one of the traps, which was at the beginning. I was like interpreting the action, and I was saying, oh, maybe it's training, but I wouldn't call it like their identity. And for me, the main thing, so the first learning is, um, it absolutely matters 0% the um, and I'll come back to this. I'll update. I'll have an asterisk on this. But in terms of receiving the microaggression, it matters 0% the person's intention, and also like my interpretation of whether or not it was a microaggression directed to a specific aspect of their identity. What matters is the impact. And I guess what I would say is the asterisk to that is, as we talk through and process and sort of get and learn and sort of dialogue with each other, then I think things like intent and impact do matter. But I would say sort of an initial sort of reception of like physiologically, what happens is they literally have done studies where like people's like cortisol axes are dysregulated as if they've had like a stressor, like they're being chased by a lion or whatever, that your body goes into a fight or flight response. And so my sort of interpretation of whether or not I would call this a microaggression for myself, that does not matter. This learner clearly does, which they've just expressed to us. Um, um, uh, the one other thing, just to slightly restate something that I've already said, we always say like, uh, is I'm trying not to mess up the saying. Assume good intent, um, but recognize impact, or assume good intent. I don't know, prioritize impact, but also then recognize that like someone who intended to be harmful, it is different than someone who didn't intend to be harmful. And so there's still sort of, I would say like we should kind of circle back to intent kind of later. Um, so um, um,
Could I ask you a follow-up while
Yes,
you're
please,
thinking,
please,
Justin or
please.
Dr. Bullock?
Yeah, you can just please.
One of the things that's embedded in this aliquot is this question from the faculty member, do other people struggle with these conversations, or is this sort of like a deficiency for just me? And I'm curious what's out there about faculty members' kind of experiences of these conversations.
Yeah. So great question. At first, I think everyone struggles with these conversations. The reason why they're to me fascinating and kind of beautiful is that they're so complicated. And there's absolutely no single like play-by-play sort of strategy that will work in every single scenario. And so I think everyone struggles. I think even people who feel good at the struggle. And this, I guess, so in I mentioned the sort of pre-briefing study that we had. We did a second study that was led by Megan O'Brien, who's a Dr. O'Brien, who's a faculty at UCSF, San Francisco General, who basically we sort of presented our student findings and kind of the similar, we kind of microaggression cases to faculty. And we had sort of two groups of faculty. There was one group of faculty that students described as skilled at responding to microaggressions, and there's another group that we called general faculty. And the first thing is the skilled faculty, that one of the main differences between the skilled and general faculty, that what the skilled faculty would say is that they knew that they were going to mess it up, that they knew that they wouldn't get it perfect, and that their mess ups and their mistakes would actually be teaching opportunities for the team. And so they sort of went into this knowing that the things that the imperfections that they have of themselves were actually helpful learning opportunities. Whereas the general faculty were more likely to say things like, I have a Black learner on my team. I feel like I really have to get it right. I'm really afraid of messing it up. And so really this like mastery mindset, and what we use the term intellectual candor to basically refer to the ways in which the faculty who students identified as skilled were more likely to openly demonstrate their imperfections and flaws, and recognize that the younger learners these days, they actually are often much more skilled than we are, even as young faculty or senior faculty, in sort of these identity dynamic type sort of situations. So I think it's very common. I think everyone struggles with it. I think at least in from our one study, the people whose students identify as doing it well, they inhabited that struggle in sort of a productive way.
That's super interesting. That paper that's the From Eggshells to Action. Is that
Yeah, exactly.
something for people to Google after the session?
Yeah.
Does anyone else have additional follow-ups, or we could move to the third aliquot, maybe with Dr. Stiller?
And sorry, can I just say one more thing? I haven't said
Sure.
this yet, and it's because I'm sort of again I would just say for all these, I'm always like internally there's a slight panic that's happening because you really want to get it right, and you feel like there's an opportunity to like get it right or really get it wrong. And so I'm trying to force myself to say like, what would I say to this person, knowing that's going to be imperfect, And one of the things in responding that we've gotten from learners is like, um, it's very important to acknowledge the microaggression like that happened, to name it as a microaggression, um, uh, but also to not overly anchor and like apologizing for us not like showing up in the way that we like not protecting learners, because what happens is people feel that actually is sort of inauthentic, that people weren't uncomfortable in the moment, but then they like when it's a less threatening environment, then they actually speak up. Yeah, so I would try to say again, I would say like I definitely noticed that made me, yeah, again, I would go with it like that made me very uncomfortable. And I probably would say like I'm sorry that I didn't speak up as you're attending.
Mm.
And just kind of like and leave it there. Yeah. But I would love if someone say something like that. Yeah, Mira, please.
I'm curious to hear, and maybe this will come up a little later, a little bit more. You were starting to talk a bit more about about intent. That might come up a little later, though.
Can I go now,
Yes.
Tim?
Let's
Or
move to
later?
the third.
Okay,
Do you,
okay, okay. All right.
do you want to?
Well, if it's not gonna,
Sure,
yeah, I
sure.
can, sure. Amir, your question is like,
I think you started talking a bit about intent and also like in the moment. But I think we got sidetracked to another thing. So I was just curious if we were going to circle back to that at some point, either now or in the later Adequat.
yeah, yeah. I mean, as a, I don't know that I'm gonna say anything earth-shattering except to say that like, I think we all have moments from our past where we came in very well intentioned, and what we hoped for was just absolutely not the impact of what we did. Once when I was a fourth year medical student, I had a third year on my team who I like after all his presentations, I would like give him little tips about what I thought like to make him stand out and do really well and and at the end of the rotation, he basically said like you were just making me incredibly anxious and every time that you said something like and it was not helpful. And my little heart was broken because I was like because I really thought I was like trying to be a good like friend. But like the impact was absolutely different. And yeah, to me, like the fellow, what the fellow said. Um, so I think one of the differences also is like if the fellow had come in and said something that was very clearly like trying to tear down a learner, um, like I would say what was said to me, what was said in the aliquot, the initial aliquot, I understand why it made the learner uncomfortable and how it was harmful, but it didn't initially come across to me as something that was like intentionally like deeply malicious. And I would say like the intentionally deeply malicious, that's when I'd be like, whoa, 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 like we got to stop like that, like somehow we like that would require a more aggressive immediate intervention. Um, and obviously again there's so much subjectivity in these like the learner may not feel like the learner may feel that I missed this opportunity to protect them by not immediately intervening, but we have to make these subjective decisions and we calibrate based off of how people like um respond and what happens, etc. What do you think? I would love your if you have I want to hear your thoughts.
I thought that was great. I don't know if others have thoughts, and if not, we could give you a third aliquot to riff on.
All right, that's it.
All right, Dr. Stiller.
All right. After consulting with a trusted colleague, you reflect on their advice and ask the student if they would like to be a part of debriefing with the fellow. They are appreciative but prefer to let you take the next steps. You decide to speak directly with the fellow later the same day. You feel nervous, but you approach the fellow privately and carefully mention your observations from rounds, noting the potential for the comment to have been perceived as a microaggression. The fellow blushes and quickly clarifies, "Everyone is slow in July. It's really no big deal."
Come back to you, Dr. Bullock, and perhaps this links well to the intent versus impact
Yeah.
domain we're at.
Yeah, I love it. This is just like each one is making me squirm even more. So okay. First I'm gonna start with the unrefined Justin that I have definitely been this person and I try to not let this person come out. There's sometimes moments where this person blowing off this someone else's like experience, that's one of those things that like gets under my skin and kind of like ruffles me. And sometimes my reaction has been to sort of um I don't even want to say it, but I'm going to say it like kind of bully back and sort of like assert the sort of like the hierarchy. um and I would say this is bad. I'm saying this because my initial response would be something to be kind of like, dude, like like it was a year ago where you were, where you were, and I'm assuming this is a guy, interestingly, but like, where you didn't know how to put in dialysis disorders and you were really nervous and all these things. Like, come on, and that's one path, and I don't think that that's necessarily the most productive path to go down. So I think I would be one always internally monitoring myself and trying to like regulate and not sort of like because yeah, my whole thing is like my personal like Justin path, like personal history is like for me bullies, I really don't like bullies. And like when and so then I tend to like have a yeah. Um I think the more um a more productive path is kind of just as a question, I guess. Like, I guess I'd say like, something like, can you imagine how if this was your like if you were your first day on our rotation, how that could like, how that might land to you? And to try and the goal is like try and get the person to get some like introspection and so it depends a little bit on and also obviously with every trainee, if you work with them for a while, you all have your own history and your own like interactions and there's different people you kind of learn respond different ways. There are some people who kind of like respond better to the like, I grew up playing sports and like sometimes the like get your head out of your ass like type like kind of pushing sometimes that actually is the more effective thing for me like Justin and I guess so and I just want to step back to the earlier part of the question which I really like the thing I liked that this attending did was they asked the learner whether or not they wanted to be a part of debriefing and basically offered to take off the sort of the load of not necessarily yes cognitive load but just like the general like affective or emotional load of having to be involved with that conversation so I think that was a very sort of savvy move to do um, and I think sort of as depending on how the fellow responded I would sort of and obviously also this the way that you have this conversation relates to like what you witnessed and saw and have interpreted and all these things and um you know what I also think is important to recognize is um while we certainly absolutely should prioritize the most vulnerable, sometimes we have to like interpret things into context and so this is like like a person most people would say and this is where this topic gets very tricky depending on which path you're coming from but most people would say like uh you shouldn't fire someone for one microaggression. I think that's what most people would say. There's always a question of like, is this a persistent pattern that someone has like exhibited multiple times, and just because I'm working with them this first time, I haven't seen it, or is this a one-off thing? And this is actually where I find having sometimes conversations with other folks can be helpful. You want to avoid being super gossipy, but for instance, like I once was told something that was kind of concerning about one of my co-fellows, and I sort of had this internal dialogue of whether or not to talk about it with our program director, with the goal of not to like yeah and I think having trusted people who would have more touch points with the learners who can put things into context who could say oh that's actually quite atypical for this person like thank you for telling me this thing but let's just like hold it in the context in which it is which I think is to me a sort of strategic and thoughtful and moderate way to like not ignore one aspect of thing like I would say would this interaction alone be something that would make me have a discussion with um, their program director, let's say. I would say it depends on what happens after this like initial conversation, like what kind of how the conversation goes after. If they really didn't like wouldn't sort of take then if I tried to give feedback, wouldn't take that feedback, that would kind of make me lean towards doing that more. And it's always a hard thing of like, yeah, of balancing a lot of different forces and a lot of different careers and experiences and all these things.
That's really helpful. I'm gonna, for the sake of time, move us to the fourth aliquot, even though I imagine there could be follow-up questions. So apologize for ushering us along. But maybe I can turn it over to Dr. Olson and then we'll move towards wrapping Dr. Bullock.
The following week, the fellow rotates off service and is replaced by a new fellow. The fellow wears a badge with a sticker noting he, him pronouns. He has dark toned skin. As the week progresses, you notice the medical student becoming more comfortable and increasing curious about critical care, opening up about herself outside of the hospital. Near the end of your 2-week stretch on service, you observe her interacting with a patient who identifies as a woman. The student uses colloquial language, "Me too, girl," to comfort the patient and normalize her anxiety about an upcoming procedure. This seems to strengthen their rapport, though you find yourself wondering about the informality of the interaction. A week later, as you complete a learner assessment form with a section on professionalism, this informal patient interaction continues to resonate in your mind. You wonder if you should note it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'd say this one, my heart rate's going down actually, compared to the other ones. So, um, one of the aspects, something that relates very much to professional identity formation that I've become very passionate about is studying a construct called identity safety. Identity safety basically refers to a state where a person feels free to exist as their authentic self. And we say that identity safety is fostered when people fulfill sort of three main needs. There's, again, interpersonal, and structural level need. Within an individual, identity safety is fostered when, particularly in medical training, when people have the opportunity to leverage their own identities and their own cultural capital in the service of other people. And so this could be things like, and so, what I always say is there's literature that says that like race concordant care and language concordant care improve outcomes. But it's not like you don't just drop two Black people in a room and then magically like they agree to do colonoscopies. There's actually like social dynamics that are happening in the room and environments that are. And so for me, the first question is I personally would absolutely like write this in the professionalism section, but not probably from the tone in which this sort of is hinting towards. For me, what this person was doing is they were providing like culturally competent care in ways that clearly, visibly, like improve the care experience for this person, and was able to do so in a like thoughtful, timely, intentional, strategic way. Um, and uh, um, so yeah, so interestingly, we this study's not out yet, but a study that is accepted and pending, we basically sort of did a survey. We tried to capture identity safety in a national sample of nephrology fellows, so about 640 nephrology fellows. And one of the things we found were that Black and Latinx identifying individuals were basically more likely to agree with the statement that my identity helps me serve the patients that I care for. And so this is absolutely agency to serve in action in a really cool way. There's the second pillar is something called upholding personhood, which basically refers to times where you feel seen in your identities, value in your identities, but there's also a person who's more than the sum of those identities. So you might recognize that someone is Muslim, but they also are a human who's more than just that singular identity. And then the third is belonging, and we ascribe to definition of belonging where I am welcomed as my authentic self, not necessarily I'm similar to these people. That one of the things that we learned from identity safety is that identity concordance absolutely can be helpful, but it is not required for identity safety. And there are many times where there are people who share a same identity who don't get along. There's plenty of times where there's like, uh, two Black people, two women, two whatever. Just because you share an identity doesn't necessarily mean that you will have a positive or safe experience. But there are certainly opportunities where identity concordance can help individuals to feel more comfort, to feel more seen, to feel less sort of overly scrutinized as being the only of one. And yeah, so for me, this is one of those things where like um, uh, I'll give just one other example of this is so in the paper that I mentioned about the identity state with the nephrology fellows, we used a method called QuantCrit, which basically applies critical race theory to quantitative methodologies. and we called the paper "Numbers Ain't Neutral." And one of the reviewers wrote back, the word ain't is easily like can be easily misconstrued and can be offensive in many uses and many things like this. And what I would say is I don't know what ain't you're using, but the ain't that I use, it's not a word that people typically find offensive. It's actually very clear. It actually has a very specific meaning, which is not. And so oftentimes we weaponize language, things like language, clothing, all these things to like enforce a certain norm, where oftentimes patients actually feel more comfortable when we speak, in ways that are authentic, not just speaking, not just using slang because you think someone uses slang, but speaking in ways that are authentic to ourselves. That may or may not reflect them. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dr. Bullock, for taking us through the findings of that really cool paper and applying it to the case. I'm interested if others have questions, and I mean that in the broadest possible sense. We have, just a couple minutes left, but we're lucky to have some live audience members, as well as our wonderful group of presenters. It looks like there's a hand raised by Hugo.
Hey Justin, thanks so much for this. This was really great, and the format was really cool. A lot of what you discuss requires an immense amount of emotional intelligence. What strategies have you used when you have, perhaps like a senior trainee who is meant to be the leader of the team, a fellow, a senior resident, who has less emotional intelligence, perhaps in this area? What strategies have you used to help them with this?
Mm, yeah. Um, so one thing, so obviously there's always the goal of I want to empower and not undermine the people who are in training below, who are, I don't want to say below, who are still in training or, who are sort of developing their own ways of doing things. There are some aspects where there are some things for me that are sort of non-negotiable things. So I don't sort of necessarily require that people pre-brief, like that they do the pre-brief, but I do require that it happens. And so that might mean that I would do it. Um, uh, uh, I think the goal is always just like for people to incrementally improve in some way. So for me, like I really care a lot about the identity dynamics because I feel like it influences care in so many ways. And so trying to pick sort of small like micro skills and give people opportunities to like debrief with this learner and then sort of check in and see how it goes. And um I don't know that I haven't had an experience where I've had someone who is deeply not receptive. I've had people that have been very burned out. And in those times, it feels like they are willing for me to just like kind of offload some of the emotional burden from them. I would love your thoughts. Yeah, I would love your experience.
No, I agree. I mean, I think oftentimes identifying something that maybe people just have blind spots for has got a long way, but I've definitely had scenarios where, even after stepping away and, and definitely less eloquently than what you've described, kind of walking through, having not done a pre-brief, which is not a routine part of my practice, I'll say. Um, I did not find that conversation landed as well as I would have hoped. And some of it, I'm sure, is on my side with just my skill and kind of having these conversations. But I did worry sometimes in two scenarios I could think of that, um, I think there was just an emotional intelligence kind of challenge with my trainee. And,
Mhm,
I recognize that in like one conversation, they and I were not going to solve this and start to build their skills and identification of some of these problems, particularly like
mhm,
awareness of microaggressions against their team members. But it left me thinking, while I don't encounter it often, like how do we approach this, going forward? And, again, I like your perspective on the pre-briefing, but I'm wondering if that will be enough. I don't know. We'll
mhm.
see what happens when I encounter it again, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had one situation in the last year that was actually with a colleague where we were really like there was some sort of social identity things that we really, really disagreed on. And I found that to be incredibly challenging because I'm someone who has I'm a very opinionated, have very strong beliefs about things. It's funny, the moral one, in some ways I actually do like Tim from your thing. Like I kind of have some beliefs about that. Like, that as doctors we have certain duties that we should, yeah, and it was very hard for me to navigate that situation.
And then we're a little bit over time, but can you give us like your 30 seconds on this question in the chat about would inquiring about the cause of the lateness in a polite and empathic way be a good approach in this scenario? And I think maybe they're meaning at the moment of the fellow making that comment.
Like instead of saying the joke, is that what you mean?
I'm not certain. I don't know if they would mean from the perspective of the fellow or from the attending observing what was happening.
Mm-hmm. Um, it's really like for me, this is really one of those like
From the
from the
fellow to
fellow.
clarify. Would that have been a
Yeah.
better approach?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Hey, like, what's going on? Yeah. Or yeah. I think that if it was, yeah. I think it's wrong for them to say, "Why are you late?" If not being on time is something that is important, as a chronically late person, that's something, I guess so it depends. If that matters to you, then yeah, absolutely, it's reasonable to ask that question.
Yeah, I think a good reminder that we can make safe environments where we still express standards or
Yeah.
expectations.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, to wrap up, I think some takeaways from today would be I would call people to reframe medical education as a process of socialization, to reframe inclusivity not as something that's aspirational, but actually something that's required for people to learn to be physicians, and to design interventions that support people participating, seeing their participation as evidence of an identity, and being a part of rallying themselves and others to do the work of medicine. And I'll put up this list of references that were drawn on the slides, and I put some of the papers I thought Dr. Bullock might talk about in it, and they did come up. So feel free to screen cap if it's of interest. And thanks to everyone who was able to be here today.
Thanks for having me. This is awesome.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Justin. That was awesome.